Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D. On the following slide is the first video in a series regarding the process of mold making and slip casting. I hope it is useful information for you.
Mold making and slip casting are great processes for both a ceramics or a sculpture class. If you wanted to just make a simple sprig, you could use a ready-made. I think this was just a kid's beach toy that I pressed into plaster. So I poured the plaster in a container. I let it set up just a bit and then pushed the object into it because the object was small and shallow. That was a possibility. Otherwise, typically I would pour plaster over the object. You could also make your own clay positive and then have the plaster poured over it. Here, I tortured my poor dog by having her step in clay. And then from that piece of clay, I made a plaster mold. Molds can be two-part. So if you're wanting to cast an object in the round, then you would want to make a two-part mold, but we're going to focus on a one-part mold. So a typical project for me for beginning mold making and slip casting would just be a tile. Now this is a square, and oftentimes we think of a tile as being a square, but you wouldn't have to just be a square, but that's what I'm going to use today. I cut this slab. It's almost a half an inch thick, and I let it set overnight between about 4 sheets of paper on the bottom and then 4 on top, and then I just put it in a regular Ziploc bag. And I did that because I wanted to get some of that moisture out of the clay. I also, when I cut my tile, I cut it slightly larger, and this is something that I do with my students often. I have them cut slightly larger than the template, and the reason for that is when the clay is really soft and plastic, and they cut an exact shape that they need, and then they handle it, they typically are going to warp it or stretch it or alter it in some way. So to avoid that, I have them cut slightly larger than necessary. And then once the clay has been allowed to stiffen up, so again, stored it between those pieces of paper, I will go back and have them cut it directly to the template. And this might require a couple of passes with your knife. If you're looking to make something that is going to fit tightly together. So I've done a tessellated tile project before where the tiles sort of puzzle pieced together. Then you're going to want to make sure that at this point you're being really careful. If you're just doing squares, you know, obviously you want nice straight lines, but it gives you a little bit more freedom to be human and maybe not do things super perfectly. So here I have my nice square. I did not mention this, but I should have mentioned that in addition, you would want to smooth your tile prior to cutting it, because in the smoothing process, you might stretch it or alter it. So I smoothed the surface. And the nature of a slab tile is that it's going to be pretty smooth anyway. So this is going to be the base for my positive. So think of the mold, and this is a little bit larger than the 4x4 that I'm using today, you can see. But this is the mold, so this is your negative. So the tile that you cast to make your mold is your positive. And if you have never done any casting before, you need to understand that you have to avoid what are called undercuts. Undercuts are any area of your tile that bevels inward. So if you look at this tile, you'll see that everything from the base up sort of forms a mountain. Okay, everything is beveling in. So this border and this border are wider at the base and then narrower because they are coming up to a point. If this bevel went in this direction and then I poured my casting slip, the casting slip would get underneath that undercut and you wouldn't be able to pull that tile from the mold. So everything that you put on your tile has to bevel upwards and to a point. Now, if you are designing a tile that has really shallow relief, typically you can get away with a tiny bit of undercut or at least just a perfectly vertical, I will say, indentation or elevation, because the slip is going to shrink a little bit out of your carved or built up areas. So, for instance, these really shallow letters did not necessarily, I didn't have to focus on the bevel on those. So as you are applying your design, keep in mind that you can carve down, which is one of the reasons for this thickness, or you can build up. However, with slip casting, you don't want there to be too much depth. I usually tell my students that their design should not project more than a half an inch or so off the surface, or be indented more than a quarter of an inch, the depth of the tile. The way that I typically would start is I would suggest that students go ahead and you could take a fettling knife and start to get a little bit of a bevel. And then I would just scrape that away. So the idea is the base or the back side of your tile will always be, in this case, 4x4. But then since I've beveled, I've lost a little bit of the surface area on what I would call the top of my tile. And just sort of a smooth as you go. And you could, because my clay is still pretty plastic, I'm just pushing the bevel, but you could cut it if you wanted to. It might save you a little bit of this cleanup. Then when I'm done beveling the outside, I would just go and look at each edge, make sure that it's got a nice bevel. And then I can continue with whatever design I choose to apply to my tile.